The weather report said impossible. Winds at 80 miles per hour, visibility near zero, and a storm front that had already grounded every helicopter in the state. But 8 climbers were trapped at 11,000 feet on Devil's Peak, and they had maybe 6 hours before hypothermia killed them all. The rescue coordinator looked at the list of available pilots and shook his head. Everyone was either grounded or refused to fly. Everyone except the guy they called Washed Up, the tourist pilot who used to fly for the military. What they didn't know was that Jack Morrison had once landed an Apache in a sandstorm to extract a wounded SEAL team, and that impossible weather conditions were just another Tuesday for someone who'd earned his wings with the Night Stalkers. Welcome to Warriors. Before we begin this story of redemption and life or death decisions, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you believe that real warriors never truly retire, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who answer the call when others can't. The Rocky Mountain Regional Airport sat in a valley 30 miles outside of Boulder, Colorado, surrounded by peaks that scraped the sky and weather that could turn deadly without warning. It wasn't much to look at: a single runway, a modest terminal building, and a handful of hangars that housed everything from crop dusters to corporate jets. But for the tourists who came to see the Colorado Rockies from above, it was the gateway to some of the most spectacular scenery in North America. Jack Morrison had been operating Rocky Mountain scenic tours out of Hangar 7 for 3 years, ever since he'd left the military and needed something to pay the bills. His helicopter was a Bell 206, 30 years old, and showing every one of them, but it was reliable and perfect for the 20-minute tours that kept him in business. $10 a head to see the mountains, $15 if they wanted to hear about the local wildlife, and $25 for the premium package that included a story about the old mining camps. At 48 years old, Jack looked like every other pilot at the airfield. Leather jacket, aviator sunglasses, and hands that showed the wear of working with machinery. His passengers usually saw him as just another local operator, someone who'd been flying tourists around long enough to know all the good photo spots. They had no idea what those hands had done, where those eyes had seen, or why he always checked the weather forecast 3 times before every flight. The other pilots at the airfield called him Crash behind his back, not because he'd ever had an accident, but because his military career had crashed and burned in spectacular fashion. They knew he'd been Army. That much was obvious from the way he walked and talked, but they figured he'd probably been a mechanic or supply clerk who'd learned to fly helicopters after his service. Nobody bothered to ask about the faded 160th sore patch tucked away in his flight bag, or why he'd never talked about what he'd done before Colorado, which was exactly how Jack wanted it. What they didn't know was that Jack Morrison had been Major Jack Nighthawk Morrison, one of the most decorated pilots in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the unit known throughout the military as the Night Stalkers. For 15 years, he had flown missions that didn't exist in places that weren't on maps, inserting and extracting special operations forces in conditions that would have grounded civilian pilots before they started their engines. He had learned to fly in weather that meteorologists called unsurvivable. He had threaded Apache helicopters through mountain passes in Afghanistan while taking enemy fire. He had landed in sandstorms, snowstorms, and conditions where visibility was measured in feet rather than miles. And he had never, not once in 15 years of military service, failed to complete a mission. Until the one that ended his career. The morning of November 15th started like any other at Rocky Mountain Regional. Jack arrived at 6:30 a.m., performed his pre-flight inspection of the Bell 206, and reviewed the day's bookings. 3 tours scheduled, a family from Texas at 9 a.m., a group of college students at noon, and a couple celebrating their anniversary at 3 p.m. Nothing challenging, nothing that would push either him or the helicopter beyond their comfortable limits. At 7:45 a.m., his phone rang. "Jack, this is Tom Bradley at Colorado Search and Rescue. We've got a situation." Jack knew Tom from the occasional joint training exercises where civilian pilots worked with rescue teams to practice emergency procedures. Tom was good people, a former Marine who'd been running search and rescue operations in the Rockies for over a decade. "What's going on, Tom?" 8 climbers trapped on Devil's Peak, caught in a storm that came out of nowhere. They're at about 11,000 feet, and the weather's getting worse by the hour. Jack looked out the hangar door at the sky. Even from 30 miles away, he could see the massive storm system building around the higher peaks. Dark clouds, lightning, and the kind of weather that made smart pilots stay on the ground. "What's the forecast looking like?" Jack asked, though he could already guess the answer. "Bad. Winds at 80 miles per hour and climbing. Visibility near zero in the storm zone. And it's getting worse. We've got maybe 6 hours before those climbers start dying of exposure." "Ground teams?" "Can't reach them. The approach is too dangerous in these conditions, and even if they could get there, they couldn't get the climbers down safely. We need air support." Jack was quiet for a moment. "What about the other operators?" Tom's voice was grim. "Everyone's grounded. Weather Service has issued a no-fly advisory for anything above 8,000 feet. The state rescue birds won't go up. The civilian operators all said no. You're the only one I haven't called yet." Jack looked at his old Bell 206, then at the storm clouds building over Devil's Peak. The smart thing to do was say no. The safe thing to do was wait for the weather to improve. The reasonable thing to do was to tell Tom that some missions were just too dangerous for the equipment and conditions. But Jack Morrison hadn't spent 15 years as a Night Stalker by being smart, safe, or reasonable. "Give me the details," he said. An hour later, Jack was studying satellite weather data and topographical maps in the Search and Rescue Command Center. The situation was as bad as Tom had described, possibly worse. The storm system was massive, stretching across 3 counties and showing no signs of weakening. Wind speeds at 11,000 feet were approaching 90 miles per hour, visibility was effectively zero, and the temperature was dropping fast. The 8 climbers were experienced, but they were trapped on an exposed ridge with minimal shelter. Their last radio contact had been 2 hours ago, and their GPS beacon showed they hadn't moved since the storm hit. In weather like this, even the best cold weather gear wouldn't keep them alive much longer. "Here's the problem," Tom explained, pointing at the map. "Devil's Peak is a technical approach even in good weather. You've got to thread through this canyon here, then make a sharp turn to avoid the cliff face. In these conditions, with zero visibility and crosswinds. It's a suicide mission," finished Captain Sarah Rodriguez, the state helicopter rescue coordinator. She'd been trying to find a way to reach the climbers for 3 hours and had come up empty. "I've got 20 years of mountain rescue experience, and I wouldn't try this approach in a fully equipped rescue bird, let alone a 30-year-old tourist helicopter." Jack studied the approach route, visualizing the flight path in his mind. It was dangerous, no question about it. The kind of dangerous that ended careers and lives. The kind of dangerous that had ended his military career 3 years ago when he'd pushed too hard on a mission that should have been scrubbed. But 8 people were going to die. if someone didn't try. "I'll need a spotter," Jack said quietly. "Someone who knows the mountain." Tom nodded. "I'll go. I've been up that approach a dozen times. And I'll need the weather updated every 5 minutes once we're airborne. Any change in conditions, any deterioration, and we abort." "Understood." Captain Rodriguez looked at Jack with a mixture of respect and concern. "You know you don't have to do this, right? Nobody would blame you for saying no." Jack met her eyes. 8 people are counting on someone saying yes. 2 hours later, Jack was running through his pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 15 years of dangerous missions. The Bell 206 had been equipped with every piece of emergency gear they could find, extra medical, supplies, cold weather equipment, and enough fuel for an extended flight in difficult conditions. Tom Bradley climbed into the co-pilot seat, his search and rescue gear already secured. He'd been on plenty of dangerous missions, but nothing like this. "You sure about this, Jack? I've seen your passenger flights. You're a good pilot, but this isn't exactly tourist flying." Jack looked at him calmly. "Tom, before I was flying tourists, I was flying Night Stalkers. This isn't the most dangerous mission I've ever flown. It's just the most important one in 3 years." "Night Stalkers?" Tom's eyes widened slightly. "You were 160th SOAR?" "For 15 years, until I wasn't." Tom didn't ask what had happened. In the military community, some stories were better left untold. "All right then," Tom said, settling into his seat. "Let's go save some lives." Jack started the engine and began his final systems check. Outside, the storm clouds were building higher and darker, and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. In 2 hours, those clouds would be dumping snow and ice on Devil's Peak, and the climbers trapped there would be running out of time. As the helicopter lifted off, Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years, the familiar calm that came over him when lives depended on his skills. The tourists he'd been flying didn't need him to be perfect. They just needed him to be safe. But the 8 people trapped on Devil's Peak needed him to be what he used to be. They needed him to be a Night Stalker. The flight to Devil's Peak took 45 minutes in normal conditions. Today, fighting headwinds and navigating around the worst of the storm system, it took nearly an hour. Jack flew low, using the valleys and ridge lines to provide some protection from the wind. But as they got closer to the mountain, the conditions deteriorated rapidly. "Visibility dropping fast," Tom reported from the co-pilot seat. "Maybe a quarter mile, and getting worse." Jack nodded, his hands steady on the controls. He was flying by instruments now, relying on GPS and radar to navigate through the storm. The old Bell 206 was getting hammered by crosswinds, but Jack had learned to fly in worse conditions than this. In Afghanistan, he'd once extracted a wounded ranger team in a sandstorm so thick he couldn't see his own windshield. "There," Tom pointed through the swirling snow. "GPS shows the climbers about 2 clicks northeast. But Jack, there's nowhere to land up there. It's all cliff face and ice." Jack had already seen the problem. The climbers were trapped on a narrow ledge about 50 feet below the summit, with no flat ground anywhere nearby. A normal rescue would require a long line extraction, lowering a rescuer on a cable to bring the climbers up one at a time. But in these wind conditions, that was impossible. "We're going to have to get creative," Jack said. What happened next would be talked about in search and rescue circles for years to come. Jack brought the helicopter in close to the cliff face, using the mountain itself to block some of the wind. Then, with a precision that seemed impossible in the conditions, he began to hover just above the ledge where the climbers were trapped. "Jack," "This is insane," Tom said, watching the cliff face slide past the helicopter's window just feet away. "One wrong move, and we're paced on the rocks." "Trust me," Jack replied, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had done the impossible before. "I've landed in worse places than this." Using a combination of GPS coordinates and visual references that only he could see through the storm, Jack managed to hold the helicopter in a stable hover while Tom lowered the rescue basket. One by one, they brought up the 8 climbers, all alive, all suffering from exposure, but all savable. The entire rescue took 43 minutes. By the time they landed back at the regional airport, word had already spread through the search and rescue community. The tourist pilot they'd all written off had just pulled off one of the most technically difficult rescues in Colorado history. As the climbers were loaded into ambulances, Tom Bradley walked over to where Jack was shutting down the helicopter. "So," Tom said, "Night Stalkers, huh?" Jack nodded. "Once upon a time." "What happened?" "Why'd you leave?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, looking up at Devil's Peak through the storm clouds. "I pushed too hard on a mission. Made a decision that got good people hurt. The Army decided I was too much of a risk to keep flying." "And you've been flying tourists ever since?" "It's honest work, and usually nobody dies if I make a mistake." Tom shook his head. "Well, 8 people are alive today because you remembered how to be something more than a tourist pilot." Jack looked at the mountain one more time, then back at Tom. "Sometimes the most important missions are the ones that don't come with orders." 6 months later, Jack Morrison was still flying scenic tours out of Rocky Mountain Regional Airport. He still gave the same 20-minute flights, still pointed out the same scenic overlooks, still made small talk about wildlife and mining history. But now, when the search and rescue coordinator needed a pilot for the impossible missions, he knew who to call. The other pilots at the airfield stopped calling him Crash. Instead, they called him Nighthawk, a name that carried respect earned through actions, not words. Jack never talked about Devil's Peak, never sought recognition for what he'd done that day. He went back to being a quiet pilot who flew tourists around the mountains and kept his military past to himself. But the 8 people who came down off that mountain alive knew the truth. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they wear leather jackets and aviator sunglasses, flying 30-year-old helicopters and telling stories about old mining camps. Sometimes they're the ones everyone else has written off, waiting quietly for the moment when their skills matter more than their reputation. And sometimes, when lives hang in the balance and weather conditions say impossible, they remind the world that there's no such thing as impossible. There's just another Tuesday for someone who used to be a Night Stalker, because that's what warriors do. They serve, they answer the call, and when everyone else says it can't be done, they prove that the only impossible mission is the one you don't attempt. Night Stalkers don't quit.